Dr. Cromwell. I appreciate it. Next, as advertised, we have Dr. Deanna Gibson. Dr. Gibson is an instructor here at the CFI Okanagan and has been since 2010. Her area of research is intestinal microbia and developing technologies and vaccines that are useful in treating some GI disease. She currently holds funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Intestinal Disease Education and Awareness Society, NSERC, and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deanna Gibson.
Hi. I see a couple of my students out there, so hopefully this isn't too much repeat for you, but I'm going to try to keep it really in English. Scientists don't do that very well usually. But I'm going to talk a little bit how vaccines work without getting into the hardcore science of it. So how do I move forward here?
I can use the probably keywords.
So, as Deanna was just mentioning, vaccination does prevent disease. And I've got a couple of pictures up here just of the diseases that can be prevented by vaccination. Diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, even cancer now, cervical cancer, HPV vaccine, Hep B, influenza. Now usually when I show this type of slide, I usually get the pictures from individuals suffering from diseases in countries where vaccines aren't widely available, like the developing countries. But if you look at the pictures closely, you'll see that more than half of them are actually pictures that I pulled from here, from North America or from even Europe, because while vaccines are very much available, people are actually choosing not to have their children vaccinated for various reasons, which I think we'll cover today. The most recent one is just right down here. It's a story about a 23-day-old baby, infant Kayla, who contracted whooping cough because right now, I don't know if you're paying attention to media, but there's a whooping cough outbreak in several places in the United States, including even across the water to Vancouver. So it is some serious concern. That's why we're all here. But let's talk about what is a vaccine. It's basically a non-disease causing molecule that mimics a particular disease-inducing microbe or cancer-causing agent in order to elicit a protective response. Okay? And the response is from our immune system. Our immunity does all of the work. The overall goal of giving a vaccine is to establish this immunity against that disease-causing microbe without actually causing disease. So the aim of an ideal vaccine is to produce a similar immune response as you would get from actually getting an infection or cancer. And this would usually follow the natural infection, but actually without getting the natural infection. So not getting all the symptoms of that particular disease agent. We want to generate a long-lasting immunity. That's actually one of the major successes of vaccination. It induces a type of memory response. And we want to stop the spread of infection. This is what we know of as immunization. Now the principles of immunization can cover a couple of different things. We can talk about an individual immune response or individual immunity. So every person in this room, if you get vaccinated or if you've been exposed to the disease, you would have protection as an individual from that particular disease. But collectively, maybe some of us aren't vaccinated or haven't actually been exposed to an agent, but collectively, if the majority of us are actually vaccinated or have immunity, those other individuals will actually be protected too. We know this as herd immunity. So herd immunity is the protection afforded to the non-immunized individuals by the high vaccine coverage in the community. This is really critically based on the number of other people who are actually vaccinated. So if 9 out of 10 of us are vaccinated, that one person is going to be protected too, because the microbe is not circulating through that community, so they're not going to get exposed. Now here's the problem. If our herd immunity actually is decreasing because people are choosing not to get vaccinated, well, there's going to be an increase and a rise in the preventable and deadly infectious diseases that we currently are experiencing right now. Okay? So why do we get immunized? Is it really our personal choice? Or is it our duty if we're thinking about collective immunity? Well, we choose to get vaccinated because we want to either protect ourselves or our families from disease and death. But we also have to consider that we have to be responsible for other individuals too, right? So for example, a good example of this is healthcare workers. Now, they probably don't, maybe they have to take a week off if they get exposed to influenza, annual influenza. But really why they choose to get vaccinated is actually because most of the patients they're dealing with are immunocompromised, they're elderly, or they're infants, the most susceptible individuals in our populations. So they choose probably to get vaccinated to influenza, for example. I call it altruistic, because they want to protect those individuals that they're exposing every day at work, right? So we have to think about our communities as well. It's not just a personal decision. Now, maybe if you're not vaccinated, you're thinking, are you on the fence, should I get my child vaccinated or not? Here's some rationale, potentially, as to why you're thinking maybe you don't want to be vaccinated. It's not natural. Natural is good, not natural is bad. Vaccines aren't natural. Wild diseases are natural, therefore vaccines are bad and wild diseases are good. I just listed other things that are natural. Cyanide will kill you. Cyanide is a natural substance. So is formic acid, the thing that ants actually secrete when they bite you. Smallpox is natural. It's a wild disease. We know these things aren't good. Rationally, we know that, right? Medicine, it's not natural. It's man-made. But it's saved our lives. If you have a child and they've had pneumonia and you've given them antibiotics, you know that antibiotics have saved their lives. If you have diabetes, or if you know somebody with diabetes, insulin saves your life every day. So, along with vaccination, we know that medicine, man-made substances can save our life. And sometimes natural substances can kill you. Why should we trust drug companies and doctors and nurses and researchers? I've been told that drug companies are somewhat shady, right? Doctors can be influenced by drug reps, so that's shady. FDA and CDC, this is government. Big pharma influencing government, so how can that be good? That research is biased and flawed because drug companies fund the research into their own products. So if you believe all these things, why should you trust recommendations to get vaccinated? Why should you? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that vaccination is almost 100% effective. 100% effective in that it can reduce disease. So some of the major diseases that our society has seen, smallpox, as Janet was indicating, I think we had the same graph. Over 48,000 individuals of annual morbidity went down to 0. It's a 100% decrease in disease. These are facts. Diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, all of these diseases are still well within the 90th percentile of reduction. So this is why we choose to get vaccinated. But how does it work? Okay, let's talk a little bit about this in a very simplistic way. A vaccine is presented really to our immune system. So this little pack down here is the vaccine, and it's basically some sort of molecule that comes from the particular agent that causes disease, or it's a weakened form of the disease, a weakened form being that it actually doesn't cause disease. And this vaccine is presented to our immune system. Now our immune system responds back, and it produces what we call antibodies. This is what an antibody looks like right here. And this antibody is kind of like the fighters of our immune system. It actually blocks any biological activity of the disease-causing microbe. So the next time we're actually faced or challenged with something that does cause disease, these little fighters come out and they block the activity of that microbe so we don't get sick. And it also gives us long-lasting memory. So even 5, 10 years later, we still have those antibodies kind of hanging out in our cells. So if we are exposed to the same microbe, again, we'll have an immune response. And again, we'll block that disease activity. If we actually understand immunology, which I'm not going to explain to you today because it is actually very complex and some of my immunology students know that, who are sitting here today. So I can't really explain besides what I just told you. It really is that simple though if you break it down. You get exposed, you make antibodies, and antibodies block further disease. Okay? But if we understand even that concept, then we can understand some of the policies that are surrounding vaccination. It helps explain why vaccines actually can't overload our immune system. One of the most common things that I'm always asked when I'm thinking about or explaining immunology is, well, there's a lot of vaccines for babies, right? When they're born, from the year of 0 to 2, they're given a substantial amount of vaccines. And I'm always asked, doesn't this overload my baby's immune system? I'm going to explain to you why that's actually not the case. It also helps explain why we need adjuvants, why we need boosters, why vaccine failure can actually occur, and why there can be rare adverse events. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. So how come if we vaccinate our babies, so many different vaccines, how come this doesn't overload their immune system? Well, the simple fact is that when we're born, so we're in utero, we actually have no exposure to microbes at all. But the minute that we're born, we're exposed to trillions of microbes in the environment, from mom, from dad, from doctor, from nurse, and basically we're colonized with these microbes. Okay? There are 10 times more microbes on our own body surfaces than we have our own cells. So actually we're exposed to trillions of antigens every single day, and we need that. We know that if we're not exposed to these antigens, we actually can develop allergies. So we need that constant immune stimulation. We've evolved with it. We're designed to deal with the exposure to microbes. So that's why we don't get overloaded. Now, just in comparison, vaccines have less than 3,000 antigens. So it seems pretty minor when you're considering all the trillions of microbes with all their antigens that we're exposed to all the time. So really, rather than overwhelming the immune system, vaccination would actually help and strengthen it. Okay? Why do we need adjuvants? You know, remember when there was the H1N1? People were like, do I take the one with the adjuvant or don't I take the one with the adjuvant? Well, why do we need it anyway? It enhances our immune response. So in my opinion, if you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, take the one with the adjuvant. All it does is basically allow the vaccine to disperse slower, giving it a longer exposure time. The two that you're probably most familiar with is alum, this is a salt, and shark liver oil, that's the one that was in the influenza vaccine. This salt really just precipitates the vaccine, and the oil really just allows it to disperse slower because the oil is kind of jumbling it all. But an adjuvant really just helps the vaccine. You can see here, remember, the biggest part of the vaccination is the antibodies. We want those antibodies. So here we have antibody titer. Up here would be more, down here is less. You can see that titer with adjuvant gives you a better antibody response. There are more. We want that. So that's what an adjuvant actually does. Why do we need boosters? My goodness, we're always like getting boosters every couple of months when we're babies or several years later. Well, the thing is that vaccination isn't perfect. And sometimes immunity can wear off. Okay, so even though the ideal situation is to produce a long-lasting memory, we haven't really quite figured that out necessarily. Sometimes it can last for 10 years. And sometimes maybe a poor vaccine only can last a couple of years. So the reason we get boosters is to strengthen and lengthen duration of immunity. Okay? So you can see here from first administration, this is again antibodies, how many antibodies there are. You get a nice little antibody response. But if you get your second administration, look how much it jumps. So it increases it. So those boosters are really important. Okay, they give us longer lasting protection. Well, how come vaccines can fail? I always meet a couple of people who say, well, vaccination didn't work for me. It's true. Some individuals do not produce a good response. How come? Well, just because some individuals fail to make an adequate immune response. Just can't. Those are the individuals that need to be protected by herd immunity, right? Secondary failure may be that, and this is more common, another reason why we need boosters, is an individual makes an adequate immune response initially, but it wanes over time. Okay, that's why we also give boosters. Well, how come there can be adverse effects? The whole reason why there can be adverse effects, very rarely, is because a healthy immune system reacts with anything foreign. Even the microbes that are colonizing our skin, we're reacting to it. But it's at kind of in a homeostasis. It's not a bad thing. But in some individuals, the majority of us might experience this, local reactions. We might get a sore arm. We'll have some swelling and redness at the injection site. You know, if you have an infant, you might produce a small fever. There might be a little bit more systemic reactions, irritability, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite. Any of those things can happen. The most severe thing is anaphylaxis. This is very rare, about 1 per million of vaccine doses. It's severe and life-threatening, but it's treatable. This is one of the main reasons why you sit in your doctor's office or you stay with your baby at least 15 minutes, so you make sure that this doesn't actually happen. You don't want to have an anaphylactic shock, but it's very rare. It's an allergic reaction to anything that you put foreign into your body. So these things can happen, but you have to weigh out the benefits and risks. What's more important? Adverse to vaccines are very rare. Now, I've been vaccinated for everything. My daughter's been vaccinated for everything. My daughter doesn't have any reactions to the vaccines. I can get a sore arm. For me, that's a livable situation. But you can see from this chart, some of the risks that are associated with even natural disease are much higher than the risks even after vaccination. Okay? So, for example, diarrhea, 66% with a natural disease, where it's about 1 in 100,000. So this is after measles, the measles vaccination. So the risks and the adverse effects are actually very rare. A couple of other questions I always get asked are, do vaccines cause Guillain-Barré syndrome? Because we've heard that before. In 1976 to 1977, there was a swine flu pandemic, and when we got immunized with influenza, there was an increase in incidence. That's what was said. That's what is said. What is that? It's basically a disease that affects the peripheral nervous system. It leads to paralysis. It can be life-threatening. It's very serious. But what is it? It's actually a mistargeted immune response to foreign antigens that affect the nerve tissues. So if you think about it in that way, it's a foreign antigen. It's actually associated more with natural disease than it is with vaccination. It's associated with Campylobacter jejuni, cytomegalovirus, and influenza. So there's more risk of getting Guillain-Barré syndrome by not being vaccinated than there is being vaccinated. Epidemiological studies have shown that there's no association to the Guillain-Barré syndrome, and therefore there's no increased risk. What about autism? How did this all start? Does vaccination cause autism? No, it does not. Autism was once, by Wakefield in 1998, associated with the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. I went to this paper because I'm a scientist, and I had to figure out how did you make this association. And what I found was that the onset of behavioral symptoms was associated by the parents. Nobody be offended, because we're all parents maybe, but you may not be objective. In 8 of 12 boys. Now, is 8 a reasonable sample size to say anything? Absolutely not. This was published, but it was also retracted this year. But since then, there have been several research groups trying to attempt to scientifically link MMR and autism. And so far, we haven't found anything. So vaccines have not ever been shown to cause autism. Now, vaccines are rigorously tested to ensure quality, safety, and efficacy. Development starts with extensive laboratory testing. And I can tell you it's extensive. We're talking about in the decade range here, okay? And vaccine research and development is carefully controlled before human trials can even begin. There's major regulatory bodies that have to approve laboratory results to give approval. And then the vaccines have to pass through 4 phases of vaccines. In fact, it's so hard to make a vaccine this day. Sometimes I wonder why I even try bothering. Because to get through some of these regulatory bodies is virtually impossible. But still, we do have new vaccines coming onto the market. And that's all I wanted to talk about today. So if you have any questions, I think we're going to address them after this talk.